Hi, I'm Ann Butera. Thank you so much for joining me in my studio today. Today, I wanted to talk about paintbrushes. In my last video, I mentioned that I had an exciting opportunity to share with you. And if you've seen my blog or gotten my newsletter, you already know what that is. I was contacted by the company Craftamo to design a collection of custom paintbrushes with them. And in order for that project to go ahead, they're running a campaign. There's just a couple more days left of that campaign, and I'll put a link below. If you sign up for it, there's no obligation. It's just to say that you would like to see this project come to life. I would be designing every aspect of these brushes with the company. We'd collaborate. I'd even be able to decide what color the handles of my brushes would be, which I find so exciting. And I find it so exciting to be able to choose the types of brushes and how many brushes, what would the essentials be, basically. And I haven't thought a lot about what I would include, although I do know that I would love to include a really small and durable chisel blender brush for lifting out highlights and veins and things like that in my botanical watercolors. Last week, I was working on two new Dahlia paintings, and with brushes in my mind, I was paying close attention to the brushes that I was using. And I noticed that for pretty much the entire time, I used just one brush. And maybe that was laziness, and maybe that just speaks to the versatility of the type of brush that I was using. This is a number 8 long round, has a nice long and tapered brush. Because my paintings are so detailed, I often get questions about whether or not I use brushes that have only one or two hairs to create the really fine lines that I create in my paintings. And the truth is no. I do have some brushes that do have only a few tiny hairs, but I don't usually use them. And the reason is that when you're using a larger brush that holds more paint, you can paint longer lines and multiple lines without having to pick up more paint. And you can have a more versatile line that can be thicker or thinner. When I announced the possible collaboration with Craft Ammo, and if you want to know more about the company, I'll have some links, including my blog post that I wrote, a link below, and you can read a little bit more about the company. They partner with artists from around the world. There are a number here on YouTube that you may already follow who have created sets of brushes with the company. And I'm so excited to have been asked. When I announced the project on my blog, one of my students, Karen, hi Karen, asked a question about choosing, or rather using your brushes. And she wanted to know how you know how to use the brushes. When you have an unusual brush like this fan brush, or I have a couple brushes that I really haven't used much that are petals. This is a petals brush. How do you use it? Now, that's a really wonderful question, and there are lots of different ways that I could answer it, but the rebel and the person who does not like being told what to do would answer that question by posing another question. How do you want to use that brush? What happens when you use that brush? You can see between the brushes I have here in these mugs and the rest that I have on my little cart here, I have a lot of brushes. And I said that for my last painting, I used mostly just one brush. Why have all these brushes if you're not going to use them? A very good question to pose for myself. But also, I was thinking it could be helpful to everyone who maybe has some brushes they're not familiar with. I thought it would be fun for us to go through the brushes and test them out and see what happens. So for this, I've just picked a random assortment of brushes, and I want you to do the same. Maybe pick out some brushes that you don't usually use, or pick out ones that you use a lot. It does not matter which brushes you choose, and you definitely don't need to have the brushes that I'm using. And I only chose these randomly because I wanted an assortment of different types of brushes. None of these are brushes I use very frequently. This one I probably use the most. I haven't used it with watercolor. I've used it with acrylic and acrylic ink, and I've used it for making abstracts, not for botanicals, but it really doesn't matter. I'm using this Canson XL watercolor paper to do my tests. It does not matter what type of paper you use, just use what you have. Again, it's just really an exercise to get you thinking about brushes and thinking about how you use your materials. So since this one's already in my hand, I'm going to start with this. And I'm using some leftover watercolor paint from my last paintings to test these out. You can use any kind of paint. Now, this brush, when you're working with your brush, I want you to notice different aspects. Think about the handle. Think about what the bristles are like. Think about how it reacts to the water and how much water it picks up, how it picks up the paint. And then we're just going to make some marks. And I want you to do that with your brush. You don't have to have a brush like this. One thing I like to do is to see how large of a mark I can make and how small and narrow a mark. And what happens if you twist the brush or press really hard? Think about what parts of the brush are touching the paper. And you could use a whole sheet of paper for each brush, to tell you the truth. See what happens when we go in with another color. When I'm holding my brush pretty loosely, I'm holding it pretty loosely and holding it pretty high up on the handle. That's something else to think about. In my most recent class, I talked about loosening up in your sketchbook and when we're painting and drawing, and holding, how you hold your painting or drawing utensil, whether it's a brush or a pen, determines how much control you have. So if you're holding it very tight, you have more control than if you're holding it very loose. If you're holding it closer to the tip, you have more control than if you're holding it farther away. When I was working on my Dahlia paintings, I realized that for a lot of the details, I was holding it very close to the end. For my class, when I was doing some more loose sketches, I was holding it further away. So pay attention to those things while you're using your materials. So I'm just going to make a few more marks here, even going over some of the areas, and see what happens when all of the bristles don't touch the paper. So just play. And as I said, you could do a whole page for each brush. I always swatch my paints and other materials, and I was thinking about how maybe I should also swatch my brushes and see what kind of marks they make. Super fun to try this. And the thing is, when I talked about being a rebel, I wasn't, I was kind of joking, but also just think about what you've been told about art making. And I always take everything with a bit of a grain of salt because in art, I really don't think there are right and wrong ways of doing things. And following rules, if I were to have followed rules when it comes to art, I would never have started making art because according to the rules, I was not good at painting or drawing. And I should have focused on other things. And so I want you to go about your art making in the same way. Don't necessarily listen to what the experts say, even me. Follow your own way. And yes, you will be frustrated if you're trying to do a certain thing and using the totally wrong tool for it. But maybe you'll discover something different. Maybe you'll discover something interesting. I wasn't going to really play with this brush on the whole page, but I ended up making lots of marks with it. We'll get another paper and play with some of these other brushes. I want you to feel confident enough to experiment and wonder, like, what would happen if I tried this, that, or the other? What if I used a material in a way I wouldn't usually? What if I make a mess? That's how you make discoveries. So, all right, that was that brush. Put this paper aside and grab another one. You could do this in your sketchbook too. This is a great exercise for a sketchbook. Now, this is a little more of a traditional brush. This is an angular shader. And I don't really use these very much. But pay attention, like how much water and paint does the brush hold? How long of a line can you make before you're gonna need to get more paint? Now here, what if we load it up even more? And what if you want to have the brushy kind of marks here? If you overlap, this is more of a dry brush. What if you go over your wet areas and move the paint some more? What if we hold it at a different angle? What happens if we twist? Use things in different ways than you would usually use them and see what happens. I'm not going to fill the whole page with this, but on your own, maybe you will want to fill the whole page. Let's come back to this fan-shaped brush. See what happens. Oh my goodness, look how cool that looks. So when you're working on your own art, maybe you feel like you're in a rut, or maybe you feel frustrated because you can't figure out how to do something the way that you, how cool that looks, the way that you would like to. And for me, when I start feeling that way, that's when I get curious. And maybe I will write in my journal. Maybe I'll play in my sketchbook. And I will try and figure out what's causing those feelings. And if it's frustration because I'm not able to master a technique that I want to master, maybe I need to watch a tutorial. Or, and this has been true for me the whole time that I've been painting, since the very beginning when I started learning how to paint. Really, my best teachers have been the materials themselves, exploring how they work, exploring what happens when I put brush to paint to paper. So this is that petal brush that I talked about. There's not enough water yet, I don't think. So I can see why it may be called a petal, because it can give you a nice pointed tip and fatten out a little. That's maybe a funny looking petal. I like how fine this line is. Let's see what other kinds of marks we can make with this. Now, I own a lot of brushes, and I think a lot of artists own a lot of brushes. You want to try new materials. Part of the fun of making art is trying new materials, and that's great. But in truth, you really don't need that many. And maybe you already have what you need. So experiment a little bit. And maybe the truth is that you just need more practice. Maybe you're not getting the results that you would like to get because you're just not comfortable with the materials yet. And that is maybe one of the hardest things. Being able to assess the fact that no, you're not lacking talent. You are lacking a skill, and a skill can be developed. And I think one of the best ways to develop a skill is to be curious and to be open and to approach things with a beginner's mind. And I think one of the best aspects of a beginner's mind and the most helpful is curiosity. Wondering what would happen if I do this? What happens when I do that? What happens when I hold my brush a certain way? And wonder, like, why did that brush mark look so streaky when these others looked more smooth? And you don't need to have an expert explain it to you. You just need to pay attention and be curious. So I have a whole bunch of other brushes here, and I'm not going to demonstrate them all today. I just brought them out as an example. And I wanted to show you one more thing before we finish, and that is, this is a chisel blender. This is a number 4. And one of the things that I want a chisel blender for is lifting up paint. And I want to be able to create a nice fine line with it. Of course, you can make different marks. And it's a very fun tool to use. Of course, you can use any brush to lift out paint like this. The chisel blender isn't your only option. So that's a handy type of brush to have. My problem with a lot of the ones that I have is that the bristles don't stay nice and tight and together. And so if I'm trying to make a nice fine line, picking up the paint, it's usually a little wider than I'd like. Another brush I wanted to show you is a scrubber brush, and these have very rough bristles, and these are great for rubbing out mistakes, or if you get some paint somewhere that you don't want it. Like, let's see, we can scrub out this section here. One challenge with these types of brushes, though, is that they tend to damage the paper. So you'd want to use them when you're finished painting in an area. But if I get a drip somewhere that I don't want it, this is a great way to take care of that at the end of the painting. And mostly I would use this in a section that doesn't have paint on a white area, because if there's, let's say, some darker green, or how about here, some darker green over that orange, if we try and lift that off, it's going to lift off both colors. And that might not be what you want to have happen. So I could go on and on and on with this. I could fill page after page with different brushes, different paints, different types of papers, exploring how my materials work. And I would really get to know each and every individual material by exploring this way. I want to instill in you a sense of curiosity. I want you to feel confident enough to explore on your own and to be curious. Again, that's so important for learning how to make art and making breakthroughs when you already know or think you know how to make art. There's so much that we can learn just by doing and being curious and exploring. Thanks again for being here. Thank you for all of your encouragement and support. If you would like to see these brushes with Craftamo come alive, follow that link below and say yes. I would love to have your support with that project. And if it does go ahead, you'll get a behind the scenes look at the process of creating a collection of brushes, which I think is so exciting. In future videos, I want to talk some more about different supplies, especially about paint. I had meant to do an updated watercolor paint video. I have had a few, and last winter, or maybe it's been over a year now, quite a while ago, actually, yes, it has been over a year, is before I moved into this new studio, I rearranged my collection of watercolor paint by color. And I just wanted to update you and tell you how that's been going in case you've been curious about what it's like to have a big collection arranged by color. I'll give you a little spoiler, and that's that I love it, but more in another video. Next time, I will also take you back into the garden. Probably by the time that video comes out, my garden will be finished for the year. We've had a little bit of frost and some things have been damaged, but the flowers are still going, and I'm going to keep painting them as long as they're still blooming. Thanks again for joining me in the studio. Until next time, I am wishing you so much joy.